everybody doing? Hello from Willow Springs. I hope you're having a great Thursday morning. Looks like we've got Imani in the audience. Sarah King, good to see you. Thanks for coming. Deerica Jackson, thank you. How's everybody doing today? Hope you folks are having a great morning. Looks like we've got 5 viewers on. Not a bad audience at all for a live stream. It's kind of rainy outside. Rainy days are always better for school, I think. You know, when it's beautiful and wonderful outside, you want to go outside and play. When it's rainy and crappy, it's not a bad day to get inside and work in your books, right? Okay. So, any questions for this week? Everybody ready for exam 3 that's coming tomorrow? Hi, T. Good to see you. Thanks for showing this morning. Hope you're doing well. Fantastic. All right. Can everybody hear me? Is my sound coming through well enough? The video's coming through well enough? Okay, fantastic. All right, let's go ahead and get started with today's lecture. All right. So today we're finishing up Social Psychology, Chapter 12. We'll talk a little bit about attitudes, cognitive dissonance, and then we'll talk about how people's behavior is impacted by the presence of others. Okay? Remember, social psychology is all about how groups and being in a group and knowing group members affects the way we think, feel, and behave. And last night or Tuesday night in webinar, when we talked about implicit attitudes, I suggested to you that your sense of groupness is wired really deep down in your brain in the way you think and process information. And so being in groups can actually affect the way you think and process information. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how other people influence our behavior. Good morning, William. Good to see you. Thanks for coming today. All right, so let's go ahead and start really quickly. Changing attitudes and behavior. One of the things, one of the areas that was sort of at the forefront of social psychology when it was born was persuasion, how to change people's attitudes. Social psychology really came into its own during World War II, when the military used what social psychologists had learned in order to try and create persuasive messages that would help the country get behind the war effort, and that could also be used to maybe demoralize troops on the other side. And so social psychology really had a lot of impact in during World War II, helping the military draft persuasive messages. So, an attitude is a relatively enduring set of beliefs, feelings, and behavioral tendencies towards an object, event, or symbol. Okay, so you can think of attitudes as having three sort of components, right? The thoughts, the cognitions that come up about a particular target, the feelings that come up about a particular target, and the behavior towards a particular target. We typically think of attitudes um, as being only an evaluation, but they're actually attitudes can be represented in our beliefs that we have and the behaviors that we engage in. So, for example, I could tell you that Carolina is that I like the Tar Heels better than I like the Duke Blue Devils. Okay, that's an affect. I would tell you, I don't like those Blue Devils. That's an affect. On the other hand, I might say something like, Duke is a really expensive school. Now, that's a belief, but that belief, that cognition, that piece of information also carries an attitude component too, such I wouldn't want to spend my money at Duke. I'd rather spend it at Carolina. And then on the other hand, if I chose a school, applying to one school or another, applying to Carolina over Duke, also conveys an attitude. So you can think about all of these components as being part and parcel of an attitude. One of the primary things that social psychologists found when measuring attitudes is that attitudes do not always predict our behavior. So I might ask you, Trevor, what your attitude towards pollution is. You might say, wow, I'm really against polluting the world. You might then turn around and throw a piece of paper right on the ground, a sandwich wrapper on the ground. And I might ask myself, holy cow, if Trevor says he's against pollution, then why does he pollute? The weird thing about attitudes is our attitudes do not often predict our subsequent behavior. And researchers have questioned, why is that the case? How come we can do a survey and ask you which political candidate you like better, and then how come that attitude doesn't predict which political candidate you vote for? And so, what researchers have found is that it depends when we think about this broad thing called an attitude. Remember, it combines behaviors, beliefs, and feelings, and also the social environment affects our behavior to a certain extent too. Sometimes you may have a behavior that you cannot demonstrate because of social constraints. Maybe I'm in a group of Duke students, and so saying that I like Carolina better than Duke or wearing my Carolina shirt won't be appropriate. So sometimes behaviors don't match up with attitudes. Now, what researchers have found is that if you really want to be able to predict somebody's behavior from their attitudes, you really need to think about it in different ways. Number one, if you really want to find out how a person, if you want to predict a person's behavior from the attitude has to be specific. So if you say, hey, are you against pollution? That's pretty general. And then I throw a piece of paper on the ground. What you want to do if you really want to predict behaviors from attitudes is to make sure that your attitude questions are as specific as the behaviors you intend to measure. So instead of asking Trevor, hey, are you against pollution? I would say, hey, Trevor, are you against throwing out old food containers when you finish eating? That's a little more specific and related to the behavior of interest. And so social psychologists have always tried to make it such that when we ask people, when we're trying to use this research to predict certain outcomes, we have to make sure that our attitudes that we are measuring are as specific as the behaviors that they relate to. Okay. Now it's also our behavior. If you ask somebody an attitude that they already strongly hold, an attitude that is easy to access, you will find that their attitude tends to predict their behavior. A lot of times when we take surveys, opinion surveys, we're asked about attitudes we don't really think about a lot that are not easily accessible. And in those situations, you're going to find that attitudes don't predict behaviors as closely as they should. On the other hand, you know what? Maybe Trevor is a guy who's against pollution, but just in this one situation, he has a blind spot. He always throws his wrappers out. So really, if you want to predict behaviors from attitudes, if your attitude is going to be general, then you need to measure that behavior across a wide variety of events. Maybe in one event, Trevor is a pro pollution or engages in a polluting behavior. But if you look at his behavior in general across a wide variety of situations, you'll find that as a general rule, he doesn't pollute. And so it's psychologists have definitely been interested in trying to understand the difference between the relationship between attitude component, the affect component of attitudes, and the behavioral component of attitudes. You know what? Sometimes we're not even aware of our attitudes. In webinar on Tuesday night and tonight, we're going to talk about implicit attitudes. And implicit attitudes are beliefs and ideas that you have in your head that you may not even be aware of. Each and every one of you probably thinks that you are, maybe I'm not prejudiced against this group or that group. I'm not sexist. I don't have any beliefs against this group or that group. And you know what? If you actually measure down deep enough, you might find that you really do. You're just not aware of it. And so we often differentiate between explicit attitudes, which take frontal lobe and awareness, and implicit attitudes, which are sort of buried deep in our brain and affect the way we think and feel. And tonight we're going to be measuring your implicit attitudes towards Arabs, and Muslims, your attitude towards women in science, and your attitudes towards minority and European cultures. And what you're going to find is that when you're asked to process information, the speed at which your brain works, making certain associations, demonstrates that you have implicit attitudes that you never even thought about. All right. So attitudes, it's a kind of a strange thing. Now, in trying to show how we can affect attitudes, even if we know that attitudes don't perfectly predict behavior, how exactly do we affect people's attitudes? And your book talks about three basic traditions: the behavioral or the environmental models. So when we talked about behaviorism in chapter 6, you can put reinforcers and punishers in messages to make those messages more persuasive. Then, as we suggested in chapter 7, there's a cognitive tradition that thinks it's a little more complex than just putting rewards and punishments in the messages. And they have a model called the elaboration likelihood model. And then we sometimes talk about the pressure that social situations put on us to have certain attitudes. And we'll talk a little bit about normative versus informational influence. Now, during World War II, researchers did find that behaviorism could be used as a way to shape people's attitudes, right? So we can use operant conditioning. We can put rewards in the message. So if we want people to start brushing their teeth or to take better care of their teeth, we can explain to them the benefits of brushing your teeth. And more importantly, we could show them pictures of people who didn't brush their teeth and all the cavities and rotten teeth that they had. So we could use reinforcements and punishments in our persuasive messages to affect people's attitudes. If you've ever seen a political advertisement, you'll know that they oftentimes tell you vote for my candidate because if you don't, you'll be getting this, this, and this, and these are all punishments. And so the idea in these persuasive messages is to put rewards and punishments in the message. If you look over here at the picture right now, I believe that's Brad Pitt. It's so highly stylized and beautiful. I'm not sure, but I think that's Brad Pitt. At any rate, that's a super handsome guy, I guess, right? And they're trying to use him to sell perfume. Now, what they're doing is they're using classical conditioning. You look at the model, you find the model attractive, you develop a feeling of positivity towards the model, and then the model is holding something that they want you to begin liking. So I see Brad Pitt, I say, wow, he's handsome. And then when I think about Chanel cologne, some of the positivity that I have towards Brad Pitt washes off towards the cologne. I remember in the 90s when Michael Jordan was a very famous basketball player, he used to sell Hanes underwear. And he had these stupid commercials that just showed him beside a pair of Hanes in several different situations. And the thing is, I don't really, a lot of people, a lot of guys maybe don't care so much. Fruit of the Loom, Hanes, we don't care. We don't care one or the other. But the weird thing is, because I kept seeing Michael Jordan, my favorite basketball player, on TV holding a pair of Hanes. I remember I get a call from my wife one day. She's like, I'm at Walmart. You need some new underwear. What kind of underwear should I buy you? And just it popped out of my head without even thinking. I said, buy some Hanes underwear. Why? I don't know. Maybe because I saw Michael Jordan talking about them a bunch of different times. And so a choice where I really had no preference, associating Hanes underwear with this famous model gave that choice to me just enough weight so that I would pick Hanes over Fruit of the Loom. All right, so we can think about classical and operant conditioning as being ways to use behaviorism to influence our attitudes. But you know what? It turns out a lot of times that you can just show a person your product. And if you show them enough, just being exposed to that product will make them like that product more. And this is called the mere exposure effect. And this is why products like to advertise themselves everywhere. And even if it's not advertising, Coca-Cola just wants to put its name on different things. And the reason that these big brands like Coca-Cola, Nike, and all of these other organizations pay for product placements is that they just want to get their product in front of your face. It turns out that the more we are exposed to something, if that initial opinion is positive, the more we will tend to like that. If you'll look right underneath me, there is a picture of Prince Harry's wife, Meghan Markle. This is in your textbook. Now, one of these pictures is as you or I would see this person, and the other picture is as she would see herself in a mirror. When you're looking in a mirror, you see the mirrored reflection of yourself. Left is right and right is left. It turns out that when you show people a picture of themselves, one the way in which other people would see them, and one the way in which they would see themselves in a mirror, it turns out that most people, if asked to pick, would pick the version of themselves that they see in the mirror. So one of these pictures, and I forget which one, would be the Meghan Markle that she sees in the mirror, and the other, which is reversed, left is right, right is left, and the other picture of her is the picture that other people would see when they walk up. You ask Meghan Markle which picture she likes, and it turns out that she's going to like the picture that she's looked at over the years, every year in the mirror. Okay? Now, bizarrely enough, if the initial opinion is negative, more presentations of the stimulus will not make you like the stimulus anymore. In fact, it will make you like the stimulus even less. This concept is called environmental spoiling. If the initial attitude is negative, more exposure will lead to a more negative attitude. So these researchers at Yale University in the early 40s and 50s looked at all of these factors that would affect whether or not people responded positively or negatively to persuasive messages. And they found that you could use a lot of behavioral components to affect the way people felt about a given target. Now, does that affect whether or not they will, in fact, behave in a way that is consistent with that attitude? Again, that's a question that we talked about on the last side. Sometimes people will express attitudes that they don't follow up with behavior. All right. Now, so these are sort of some of the basic ideas for how we affect people's behavior. Now, the one model that I like was developed by two researchers at Ohio State University. This is called the Elaboration Likelihood Model. You know what? Sometimes you can use things like an attractive viewer uh, to sell a product, or you can use mere exposure, or you can use any of these things that we'll call peripheral persuasion cues, right? So if I'm trying to sell you a particular course online that I want you to buy, you know what? I can put the salesperson in a pair of glasses and make them look like an academic, and you can say, "Wow, that person is clearly an academic, so this course that they're selling must be useful." You know what? That's not really related to the message, if you will. That's kind of peripheral to the message. But it turns out in some situations, people really respond to these environmental cues. How attractive the model is, how intelligent the model is, whether or not they seem similar to you. These peripheral cues may affect how persuasive we find some messages. But what Eagley and Shaken in Ohio University found is that sometimes people don't pay attention to how attractive the model is. Instead, they pay attention to the message within the model. So when you're crafting an advertisement to sell a product, when are people going to pay attention to the arguments that you use? And when are they going to pay attention to how attractive your model is? That is to say, when are they really going to elaborate and think about your argument and use central processing? Or when are they going to take shortcuts and just look at how attractive or smart your model seems and go through what we would call the peripheral route to persuasion? So Ely and Shaken made this model, and they tried to explain how people decide whether or not they're really going to focus on the message or whether or not they're going to look at how attractive the model is. Now, this is very important. If you think about it, in court cases, a lot of times in the court of law, we put people into a jury and we choose them specifically because they don't know anything about the topic. We'll have this voir dire procedure where the lawyers will ask potential jurors, how much do you know about this topic already? And a lot of times, those jurors that know a lot will actually be tossed out of the jury because the lawyers want people who don't have any formed opinions. And what this means is a lot of times you're putting people in a case where they don't have the requisite information and sometimes the ability to think about the complex aspects of the case. Think about if we were doing a product liability or a copyright infringement case or something that was really, really complex, right? Where we were maybe looking at a murder case and I was asking you to understand DNA evidence that I want to use in this case. In those settings, I'm asking you to think very deeply. Sometimes people think deeply, but sometimes they don't. And what Eagly and Shaken found was that really people only pay attention to the information in the message. They only pay attention to the details if they A, have the ability to process, that is, if the message isn't over their head in terms of complexity, and also if the message is important to their life. So if we're talking about making a change at Wake Tech that is going to affect my life while I'm working there, I'm going to be very motivated to process the information. If, on the other hand, as a faculty are voting about some sort of attitude, some sort of concept, some sort of policy that's going to affect students and not teachers, I'm not going to be as motivated to process that message. So what Eagly and Shaken found was that when you provide people a persuasive message, whether or not they pay attention to the facts inside your persuasive message or the peripheral cues depends upon whether or not they have the ability to process the persuasive message and whether or not they have the motivation to process the message. So if I'm taking you into a court of law and I'm asking you to think about product liability, copyright infringement, and all these legal concepts that are above your head, uh, you might instead focus on how trustworthy the lawyer seems. And you might pick the lawyers based upon how trustworthy. Oh, that person's got shiny shoes. I don't trust people with shiny shoes. That person's shoes are kind of scuffed. You know what? People who have scuffed shoes are more real. So I'm going to believe that lawyer. So do you see how in this case, maybe I can't think about the concepts. It's above my ability to process. So instead, I'm going to look at how trustworthy one of the lawyers looks when coming to my decision. On the other hand, if we're talking about something that I can really get my head around and something that really affects me as a person, I'm instead going to pay attention to the arguments that you use in your persuasive message. And I'm really going to focus and process this information, right? And so, how do we know when to use peripheral cues or central processing? Depends upon the situation. So those of you who want to go out and get in business and you have communication degrees and you want to use advertising, when you're thinking about creating your persuasive messages, think about central cues, central processing, but also understand that it's important for you to use peripheral cues in making your arguments more persuasive. Attractive sources are more persuasive than unattractive sources. Experts are more persuasive than non-experts. However, research has often found if you provide somebody a persuasive argument, they will find somebody who is more similar to them, more persuasive than an expert. So, if you're going to try and tell me that your medicine works well, You can provide a doctor telling me that 3 out of 5 doctors have believed that this is more uh, effective. But what I'm going to find more impressive is if you have somebody that looks just like me. Hey, I'm John. I'm a college professor and I teach every day, and teaching students gives me a headache. And that's why I use Excedrin PM. I'm going to find the person who is more similar to me even more persuasive than a person who seems like an expert. So, when you bring somebody up in your court case and they're going to be giving testimony, it's great if they're an expert, but if the people on the jury find similarity with that person, they're going to find that person to be far more persuasive than an expert or an attractive person. Yes, we do, Andrea. And you know, the crazy thing is, social media allows us to send out all kinds of persuasive messages. And most of us aren't thinking deeply about all of the persuasive messages we get. I get 10 or 15 different persuasive messages about very complex things like the war in Ukraine, the economy, whether or not the political system is rigged or not rigged. These are very complex issues that require very complex answers. But instead, we get a video from somebody who looks just like us, an old country boy that looks just like us, telling us what we're supposed to believe. And because that person looks like me, I find them more persuasive. Or we get somebody who appears to be an expert, and we don't think that deeply about our social media attitudes. I hate to say this, I'm the same as you, but we really don't. A lot of the things I'm asked to take strong opinions on, I don't really have the time to focus on the details. Instead, what we do is we look at peripheral cues, right? I had a DUI case last year, and a juror got kicked out because he had a previous DUI that got out of, and they dismissed him on the grounds of being an expert. Who dismissed him? Was it the was it the prosecution or was it the defense? Right? Um, Obviously, that lawyer thought that this person getting out of a DUI was going to be bad for their case. So obviously, and you know, there are actually applied psychologists who work in a field called trial consulting. I have a colleague of mine who went to graduate school who is a trial consultant. And what they do is they try to figure out which peripheral cues are going to be more effective for the potential juror pool that you get, and how to craft a message to really resonate with the particular juror pool. So if we're doing a case down in Texas, you're the people from Texas are going to find things persuasive that are completely different from people you might find in Connecticut, right? Or out on the West Coast. And so, what trial consultants do is they're social psychologists who go in and do surveys before the trial to find out what the potential juror pool believes and what their peripheral cues would be, what kind of peripheral cues they would respond to. And then what you do when you come to voir dire, Trevorman, is you try to massage the jury so it has a group of people that represent that contingent that you've measured, and then you provide a case that resonates with that particular contingent of people's beliefs. And it was the DA, yes. So the DA thought that that person getting out of a DUI might make them more predisposed to letting you go off of a DUI. Very tricky and devious. I hope your lawyer was good too. All right. Now, here's the weird thing you'll find. A lot of times, you know, you probably have people you think who have the wrong political attitude. Either they're a Biden voter, and now that they've seen gas prices go up, you think they should give up their support for Biden. On the other hand, you may be the kind of person that has some Trump friends, and you say, wow, I know you liked him at the beginning, but now he's done all these awful things, and you like him even more. And so the weird thing is sometimes people's attitudes are sort of affected by the tension that's going on in their own body. And there's a long tradition of research in social psychology that identifies this one force that affects our attitude called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance. People love to be consistent. Remember, we talked about attitudes as being your beliefs, your feelings, and your behaviors. Well, all three of those things, if I have an attitude towards Trump or Biden or anybody else, right, that attitude comes out in the way I behave, in the beliefs I have, and in my affect responses. I hate this guy. I hate that guy. I like this guy, right? And so human beings like for all of those parts of an attitude to be consistent. So I want my behavior to be consistent with my beliefs, and I want my attitude and I want my beliefs and my behavior to be consistent with my affects, with my feelings. People love a sense of consistency. And what we'll find is that sometimes you can use this inconsistency to influence their attitudes. Now, a lot of times people will do something and then evidence will come out later to maybe suggest that what they were doing or supporting wasn't such a great thing. And what you're going to find is that instead of changing their attitude, people sometimes harden their attitude to be consistent with their previous behaviors. Let me explain how this goes. In the famous study by Leon Festinger, what he did was he gave people a task to do, an incredibly boring task, the most boring task you could possibly imagine. It was a peg turning task. They had 100 pegs, a 10 by 10 board, and they turned each peg 1/4 turn to the right, and they would go left to right all the way to the bottom. When they got all the way to the bottom, they would then go start back at the top and turn the peg the other way, turn it back the other way. And for an entire hour, they did nothing but turn pegs, the most boring task you could possibly ever do. All right. At the end of the task, they asked these people to recommend they asked them to recommend the task to other people. Hey, we've got some people coming in, and we want you to help us pump them up by telling them that this was a great task to do. Now, it was a boring task. It was absolutely horrible. So they were asking these people, in a sense, to lie. Tell this next person that this task is going to be a lot of fun. Now, in order to motivate you to do that, I'm going to give you some money. Half of these people, they gave $1 and they said, hey, tell this person that this task is really a lot of fun and I'll give you $1. The other half of the people, they said, tell this other person that that they're going to love this task, and I'll give you $20, which in 1960 was a ton of money, right? Now, and so what they did was they paid these people to lie. Now, some people they didn't give them much motivation to lie; they only gave them $1, and some people they gave a lot of motivation to lie. Now, after lying to this person, they then had the person fill out a questionnaire. I want to get your true opinion. How much fun was that task? And they found this very bizarre thing. The people who were paid $20 to lie, they hated the task. When asked later, they said, no, I did not like the task. Okay? On the other hand, the people who were paid only $1 to say that the boring task was fun, they actually showed more enjoyment of the task. They said, yes, I really liked the task. And the idea here is that the person who is induced to lie without much motivation, when they're asked after the fact, why did you say that? They say, no, I didn't lie. I actually liked that task. I actually liked that task. So the weird thing is, if a person engages in a behavior that stakes out an attitude, and then some disconfirming evidence comes out, it's easier for that person to change their attitude to be consistent with their behavior than it is to say, wow, that behavior that I had was wrong. So, for example, I might say somebody voted for Donald Trump, and then Donald Trump did this negative thing, and this negative thing, and this negative thing, and this dishonest thing. And I might say, wow, What do you think about Donald Trump now? Well, I can't take back my vote and all the stuff that I said about him now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to discount all this negative stuff and say, you know what? I like him even more than I did before. And that's because I can't take back my behavior. And it's embarrassing to have a behavior that's not consistent with your attitude. And so what people will do is they will change their attitude to become consistent with their behavior. And the same thing might happen with a Biden voter. You voted for Biden because you didn't like that guy, Trump. And then suddenly, 6 months later, we're involved in a war and gas prices have shot through the roof. I can't take my Biden vote back, right? But if I say, you know what, you were right, Biden is an idiot, now I've got an inconsistency between my behavior and my attitude. So, what people do is they find that it's easier to keep a negative attitude than admit that they were inconsistent. Yes, it absolutely sounds like political campaigns. And the crazy thing is that a lot of us hold our attitudes for the wrong reasons. We hold them because we've responded to peripheral cues. Well, if Beyonce likes it, then I must like it, right? And then a lot of times our behavior based on these attitudes turns out to be wrong. And the weird thing is, a lot of us hold attitudes and we don't really know why we have these attitudes, but we're unwilling to give them up. And so cognitive dissonance in the central and peripheral routes to persuasion can kind of explain the crazy things that happen when we try to shift people's attitudes with persuasive messages. You're right on target, Trevor, and I could get real political and say stuff like that, but I'll try to not to, right? Now, here's the other thing. It turns out that other people do have the ability to change the way we behave. We typically call this changing of our behavior to be consistent with the desires and demands of other people. We call that conformity, or your book will call it compliance, or your book will call it obedience. Although your book differentiates these three things, I would say they are all the same. They are just versions of social influence. I don't know if you ever did something stupid when you were a kid and got caught for it. And you did something stupid because all your friends were doing it. And then your mom or your dad says, well, why would you do that? And you have to explain your behavior, but now you don't have your friends there with you. And you realize how stupid that behavior was. And your only response was, well, it's because my friends did it. And your parents will look at you and say, well, if your friends jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge, would you? The idea is, yes, you probably would. And here's the crazy thing, so would your parents too. Your parents are also targets of social influence. Our behavior, a lot of times, is really affected by what other people do. Now, you can think of this in two ways: informational influence and normative influence. You know, using other people as a source of social information is a legitimate thing to do. I don't know if you've ever been at a fancy restaurant or in a place that you've never visited before and you're not sure exactly what to do. You will often look around to see what everybody else is doing. We call that informational influence, and that's when you use others as a legitimate source of information. When I visited Mexico earlier, I went to Mexico over spring break, and I was in a lot of stores and restaurants, and I did not know how to behave in that culture. Exactly, how do you order food here? How do you do this? I found in Mexico, when you go to these fast food restaurants, you don't pay for your food until you finish eating. So I would go up to the counter, I would order, and then I would try to pay money, and these people would laugh at me and do this. And I would sit down and eat, and then you pay for your food. And so I learned by watching others that even though in the United States we pay for fast food upon point of sale, in a lot of restaurants in Mexico, you don't pay for the food you order at the counter. You sit down, you eat it, then you pay. And I was using informational influence to adjust my behavior. Now that's okay, but one negative thing that you will find is this thing we call normative influences. Sometimes we engage in behavior that we clearly know is wrong or adapt attitudes that we clearly know is wrong because we want to be accepted by our friends around us. Sometimes in high school, you may have drank that beer, you may have smoked that cigarette, uh, you may have taken part in smoking that joint with your friends, even though you knew it was completely wrong. You did not want to look like the nerd in front of your friends. When that happens, we call that normative influence. And sometimes people are influenced by others to do things they wouldn't do because they want to be accepted. And it turns out that normative influence and social influence definitely work. Your book's going to talk about two experiments that demonstrate this. The Solomon Asch line judging study. He brought people into a laboratory and told them that he was going to do a visual perception task. They were supposed to take this reference line and tell the experimenter which line was the same length as the reference line. Can anybody tell me which of these comparison lines, one, two, or three, is the same length as the reference line? Can anybody see that? Tell me, which is the line that is the same length as the reference line? Anybody know? Now, what Solomon Asch did was he put people in an experiment where they were with five other people. But what these people didn't know was those five people were secretly working for the experimenter, and their job was on some of the trials they were supposed to give a clearly wrong answer. And the idea was if the real person was the last person in the line to give their choice, would they say what the right answer was, or would they give the wrong answer to be just like the rest of the group? And what Solomon Asch found was that one third of the time, when the answer was clearly wrong, people would follow the majority. And the only reason he suggested this could happen is because people didn't want to look foolish in front of other people. So, what he's saying, De'Erica and William, is that if you were in a group and all five members of that group said the correct answer was number three, one third of the time you would actually say three just to be accepted. Yes, absolutely. And that's a great point, De'Erica. Sociology and social psychology sort of are very interested in the same sorts of issues. And what he found is that people's desire to conform sometimes overwhelms their ability to see reality as it truly is. How many of you have friends whose political opinions seem to be drawn more from their desire to fit in with a group of people than to hold their own opinions? I'm a 50-year-old Caucasian guy, Southern guys from the South. All my peer group are Donald Trump fans. And so it is very hard for me to hold my initial liberal opinion because it would be much easier for me to fit in to say what I consider to be Trump bullshit with around all of my buddies. And sometimes I don't fit into my group as well as I should. And I can tell I'm a little bit on the outsider because I won't change my opinion from what I believe to be the objective facts on the ground. However, there's great pressure for us to fit in that way. And Solomon Asch demonstrated that people will just disbelieve their eyes if it helps them fit in with a group, De'Erica. Now, Stanley Milgram also did an experiment to look at influence, but I would suggest that his experiment was a demonstration of normative influence. Stanley Milgram was interested in the genocide that occurred in Germany during World War II. And if you think about it, this is not the only genocide that there has been. There's been Pol Pot out in the 60s and early 70s. The Asian leader created a genocide in Russia. Millions of people were killed by Stalin. And in Germany, almost 7 million Jewish people were exterminated by the Nazis. And Stanley Milgram was interested, how can so many people engage in such horrible behavior? And really, after World War II, questions in the psychological field revolved around the question of whether something was wrong with the German people. Was there something wrong with their culture that predisposed them to this violent, aggressive behavior? Stanley Milgram didn't think so. He thought, you know what, there was nothing different or weird about the German people. They instead represented the same normal group influence that each and every one of us could fall prey to at some point in our life. We might come to a situation where we are asked by a legitimate authority to do something that goes against our moral values. And what Stanley Milgram showed is that if you see a person as a legitimate authority, we will often take their advice and engage in behaviors that we should know is wrong. So here's what he did. He brought people into an experiment, and he brought two of them in. One was working for him and one was not working for him. Now, the one that wasn't working for him didn't know that, and they basically thought there were two participants in this experiment. He told them, you know what? This is an old behaviorism experiment. We're seeing if we can use punishment in the form of shocks to help people train people's memory. So we're going to use punishment, shocks, to help people train their memory. And he had the two people choose their roles. One person was going to be the teacher, and one person was going to be the learner. And he had it set up so that the naive participant, the one who didn't know what was going on, was always the teacher, and the person who was working for him was the learner. Now he took them into a room and showed them a very big, scary looking electrical generating machine he called the shock learning machine. He gave the naive participant a shock at about 90 volts to show him that these shocks kind of hurt. And he told both people, he said, while these shocks are very painful, they are not dangerous, okay? They are not dangerous. And the experimenter was wearing a white lab coat, looked like a doctor, was in a laboratory and everything. So he puts the naive participant in one room and he tells them, you have to start giving this person shocks. And they start at 30 volts, and you're going to go up every 15 volts for every mistake, all the way up to 450 volts. And in fact, on that end of the machine, there's a little gray box area that says dangerous, extreme shocks, please be careful. And what he wanted to know was, he set it up so that the learner was in another room and he used a recording, and that learner was supposed to make mistakes and get shocks. And what he wanted to find out was, would a normal person take those shocks all the way up to the triple X dangerous area, right? And he set it up so that the person in the room, the learner, would start screaming, hey, let me out, let me out. I don't want to be in this experiment. And he would tell the teacher, he would say, you must continue. The experiment requires that you continue. And every time the person went up in the shocks, the learner would complain and cry out for relief. And he wanted to find out how far up that shock chain would the naive participant go on the recommendation of someone wearing a white lab coat in a laboratory. Now, Deerica, he asked his sociology friends, his psychology friends, his anthropology friends, any scientist he could. He asked them, how many people do you think will go all the way up to the intensity level? And what his social psychologists, his sociology friends said was, you know what, only 1 to 5% of the population will go all the way up to the extreme shock levels. These are the people with personality problems, your sociopaths. Only the sociopaths will go up all the way to the strongest level of shock. Well, you know what Stanley Milgram found? Two-thirds of all people, normal people, people just like you and me, would transmit severe pain to another person on the recommendation of a doctor, right? And so what he found was that people would, in fact, do horrible things if they perceived a legitimate authority telling them to. Now, here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to get political one more time. I think each and every one of us knows that storming the Capitol building, storming the U.S. Capitol, breaking windows, looking to kill lawmakers, these are things that you do not do. These are horrible things. Can you imagine breaking in the U.S. Capitol and trying to damage the place, breaking into offices and looking to hang lawmakers? Uh, that sounds pretty horrific. Why would people do that? People did that because legitimate authorities told them it was okay to do that. And if you see most of the people being brought up on charges right now, their main statement is they thought that they were engaging in a legitimate protest. They weren't doing anything wrong. Breaking into the Capitol is not sedition. Instead, I was doing something that I was directed to do by a legitimate authority. So, people who do bad things like this, or maybe engage in harmful acts to other people, a lot of times, if we perceive a legitimate authority, we will suspend our own sense of right and wrong and accept what that authority says as legitimate information. Yes, but here's the thing, these people were told you're not a mob, you are instead freedom fighters, you're patriots, you're doing what our forefathers did. So, in a sense, these people were convinced, and the people telling them that they were legitimate authorities, that they were engaging in a legitimate protest, were people they perceived to be legitimate authorities. Um, uh, yes, exactly. If the judge, if your preacher is telling you that these people are witches and must die, suddenly you're not killing somebody. Instead, you're doing what your preacher says. You're getting rid of evil from the world. Absolutely, Andrea. And the point is, legitimate authorities have more power than we really think. So when we try to say that you as a leader caused this crowd to get excited and to break the law. Now, I'm not sure how a court of law assigns guilt and responsibility. Most of the time, if you did it, it's your fault, whether or not somebody else told you to or not. But from a psychological perspective, the legitimate authorities that conveyed this attitude of violence to these people bear some responsibility. Maybe not in a court of law, but Stanley Milgram and those people who are interested in informational influence would say that we cannot discount the importance that these legitimate authorities have. And then one final thing, sometimes human beings don't act when they should act, and this is the same kind of influence. But sometimes influence works to keep us from doing the right thing. Right now, this all started with a horrible behavior in 1964. A lady named Kitty Genovese was murdered in her apartment complex, and police are pretty sure that 38 of her neighbors actually watched this attack take place. Now, the assailant, she screamed, and the assailant ran off a few times and came back to finish stabbing her. It was a fellow with a mental health problem. This guy took over 45 minutes to kill this lady in the courtyard of her apartment while 38 of her neighbors watched. And none of those neighbors called the police until it was too late. And there were huge newspaper articles, and this was seen as the proof that cities were horrible, that New York City in particular was horrible, and that this was the end of the world. But some social psychologists suggested this was just another form of social influence, but this social influence works in the opposite way to keep people from intervening when they should. And this has been termed bystander apathy. Sometimes in emergency situations, the more people that see the event, the less any one of them is going to act. So if you are having an emergency, if you're being attacked, if you're being mugged, if you're hurt, sometimes it's better if only one person sees you than if a group of people sees you. Bizarrely enough, the group of people will create an inertia which keeps any one person from jumping in and assisting you in the emergency situation. These two researchers, Bibb Latney and John Darley, did a bunch of studies where they showed that people in an emergency situation will be less likely to help if there are other people present who are not helping as well. So they would do things like bring people into a laboratory. Only one of them would be the naive participant. The other six people there are working for the experimenter. And they're all told to not pay attention to the emergency that happens. So they were sitting in there filling out paperwork, and Darley and Latine, they pumped smoke in under a door. So suddenly the person sees smoke coming into the rooms. This building is on fire. And what they find is if the person is filling out paperwork by themselves, as soon as they see smoke, they get up and go tell the experimenter, hey, something's on fire. We better call the fire department. But what they find is you put that person in a room with six people who ignore that smoke, the person is going to be less likely to get up and intervene in that emergency situation. Yes, William Cray is right. You should always give specific instructions. Like if you see an accident, tell someone to call 911. Yes, here's the deal. Emergencies are ambiguous. If you see two people arguing and a man is grabbing his wife or the female and shaking her a little bit, you know, do they really want you to intervene? Yes, he may be attacking her and assaulting her, but what if they're in a lover's quarrel and they do this? And what if this is the dynamic of their relationship? Is this really an emergency? And what we do is we look at a group of people around us. If they're not acting, then we may come to the conclusion that this is really not an emergency. Here's the other thing. Um, Diffusion of responsibility. If you see a bunch of other people and they're not, and they're there, you might say, well, why is it my job to intervene? Maybe one of these other people will intervene. You will diffuse the responsibility. And then here's the other thing. Sometimes you don't want to be the first person to say smoke or fire if you're wrong. Think about how embarrassing it would be if you go over there and jump in the middle of what appears to be a fight between a man and a woman, and they're actually practicing for a play they're in. How big a fool would you look, right? Okay. Or what if you went over there and tried to break that fight up, and all of a sudden, the person turned around and started beating you up? There is a cost of being wrong, right? And so there are lots of social factors that are working to prevent us from interacting in these emergency situations. William Cray provides great advice, and this is what Darley and Latine would say you should do if you're in an emergency situation. Since people have these three why problems running through their head that impairs their behavior, you, as the person who needs help, must allay these fears. So you must say, I need help. So you're saying this is an emergency situation. So if you're laying on the ground and your knee's blown out and you can't get up, or you're having a heart condition and people are walking by, you must verbalize, I need help. And then you pick a person. Don't say, I need help. Say, you, sir, in the blue shirt, can you please help me? And call 911. So William Cray is right. In this situation, the presence of a group of people makes it less certain that any one person needs to act, or even that there's an emergency. So what you need to do is point to a person, tell them that you are having an emergency, and then provide them with the behavior that you'd like for them to engage in order to help you with that emergency. But the weird thing is, sometimes people do things that we don't think are pro-social. It's not because people are bad, because people are cold, because all Nazis are evil. It's because the social environment really pushes our behavior, sometimes to do bad things and sometimes to avoid doing good things when we should. Okay, that's all I have to say for today. Remember, we have class tonight at 7 p.m. I hope to see you in the webinar. If you can't come to the webinar, do your discussion boards so you can get uh, credit for this week's collaboration. Finally, exam 3 goes live tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. 8 a.m. in the morning, and I will be having my live exam review from 9 to 9:35 tomorrow morning. If you can't make the live review, of course, the review will be a recording in the exam folder. Yes, there is a test folder. Hey, have a great day, folks. Thank you for coming. Take care. And remember, be sure to avoid that social influence. All right? Take care. Have a great day.